I'm going to ask a question that I probably shouldn't ask right before lunch. Are you hungry this morning? And if you weren't already hungry, you're probably hungry now, because I asked it. You know, when we get hungry, our stomach starts to rumble, and I don't need to go any further, do I? But I want us to focus this morning on something that we need to hunger and we need to thirst for. This picture is a dinner plate that comes from a place setting from my wife's grandmother. And when she passed away, and when Mary and I got married, we got half of that we split it with her sister. And so the amount of food that has been on this plate behind me, the Christmases, the Thanksgivings, the wonderful meals that have been on this plate and continue to be, they leave you satisfied at the end of the meal. But you know what? That plate, if you look at it, it's an old plate. It's from the 60s. And it's something that's been used ever since. It wasn't just put away. She used it every Sunday when they had their Sunday meals. And if you look, there's deep cuts into each plate because they have been used and they have been well loved. And those who went away from those meals, they were full. But guess what? They had to come back. And she would invite you back. And you had to keep eating. You had to keep eating because what we hunger and thirst for in this life, in just a few moments at the restaurant, is something that we're going to have to keep doing over and over again. And we can fill our plate with so many things, can we not? This morning, I don't know what's on your plate. I don't know the struggles that are in your life. I don't know if the plate is full and you're happy and you have the opposite of difficulties right now. But I know that if whatever your plate is, whatever's on your plate, it cannot bring true satisfaction. It will not bring fulfillment. But what Jesus is telling us is, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be satisfied. They will be fulfilled. We've been looking at these Beatitudes as we're devoted to the Apostles' teaching for the next several weeks. And we're seeing this Sermon on the Mount as Jesus sat down on that mountain, on that rock, and He began to proclaim to those Jews on that day. He said, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. He concludes with the Beatitudes with, blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. In the first three Beatitudes that we've looked at, they represent what it takes to become a child of God, to stand as a Christian. But this beatitude represents the first beatitude for those who walk a Christian life. Jesus is explaining, now that you've become a Christian, this is how you walk as a Christian. So many times we sit there and we think, well, what would Jesus do? We just think, well, Jesus was a great man, and you know, I can look at any situation I have and I can just weigh up what would Jesus do. But Jesus actually taught us what we should do. And if we hunger and thirst for righteousness, that is what will bring satisfaction. Guarantee. So in order for us to be able to do that this morning, we're going to look at the claim, which has been it's identical for all 9 of the Beatitudes, that you'll be blessed. And if you'll recall, the word makarios was something understood by a Jew at that time, was different than the Romans' understanding of the word. It meant a recipient of divine favor, or a recipient of God's favor. And so the early church, did they understand this concept? Did they understand this blessing? We've seen it for several weeks now. We've looked at different things that showed the providence of God for how the early church on the day of Pentecost came together in the way that they did. And how they were able to continue in the apostles' teaching, to be devoted to that. They saw growth. They saw awe that fell upon every one of them. Acts 2 and verse 43. But I'd like for us to look at verse 46 for just a moment. Acts 2 and verse 46. It says, "And day by day, attending the temple together and breaking bread in their homes, they received their food with glad and generous hearts." That's interesting. This morning, you have fulfilled this concept. You're attending. You're here. You see, they were attending daily in the temple. We understand this was Solomon's portico. This was the outer court where they would be worshiping together as they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching there in verse 42. I think it's important to realize the word here, and this I read from the English Standard Version. This is the version that I usually use, either this or the New King James Version. But notice, the word therefore attending, it literally means they were busily engaged in. The word means to busy oneself with or be devoted to. And yes, it's the same word used back in verse 42. And they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to the fellowship, the breaking of bread, and the prayers. And so as they did this, they did it every day. They were not just attending. See, we can attend. In our understanding of the word attend, you're here this morning, and you're sitting in that chair, but you know what? We can be focused on the plate in which we've got to focus on Monday. Maybe we got a bill due on Monday. We've got to make sure we don't miss that deadline, or we'll get that penalty. Or maybe there's a deadline that the plate is so full we are just, it's all we're thinking about. And it's causing difficulty to focus. We can just sit here and be in attendance, but not be busily engaged in the teaching and proclaiming of God's Word. It's something that takes focus. It's something that we've got to devote ourselves to. We have to think about it. We've got to focus on it. And so we have to try to get those things out of our mind at this moment and focus on what Jesus is telling us to be devoted to His Word. And so if we can do that, we will understand the true blessing, that there is true blessing. And the attendance is not just on Sunday morning, Sunday night, and Wednesday night. Notice what they did. They continued daily, every day. What did Jesus say in Luke 9:23? If anyone desires to come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross every quarter. Just on Sunday morning, He said to take up your cross daily and follow after me. If you want to follow Christ, it's a decision you've got to make. But we've got to realize that what He's offering us is greater than anything my wife's grandmother could have ever prepared for that plate. He's offering us true satisfaction. Satisfaction that the world doesn't understand, the world cannot offer us. And for us to understand the characteristic, we have to have this claim solid. It has to be ours. We have to know that we are blessed and that God is making a way for us. The characteristic is those who hunger and thirst, not to be filled at the end of the service, but for righteousness, for a upright behavior. Well, I know how to have an upright behavior because I was raised to mind my family, to take care of strangers. It's funny, maybe you saw this on Facebook, and I was trying to train Gabriel and James on Friday morning at the breakfast table, and I was trying to explain to James, and the boys, I said, you want to make sure when you shake someone's hand, you look them right in the eyes, and you shake very firmly. And I said, you make sure that you never shake hands sitting down. And James said, and never, he's 3. He said, and never shake their booties. I just said that. I did. It was hilarious. So we're trying to teach him, and he's going to take our teaching and he's going to apply it to something else. And it became one of the funniest things we had experienced all week. But when it comes to trying to train our children the way they shall go so that they will not depart when they are old, You know, we can do a really good job at trying to make sure under my roof this is how things are. But we're told, children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. And it says, fathers, do not provoke your children to wrath, but bring them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. You see, it's not up to a father to come up with just what goes for his children. It's in the Lord. And so a child is going to obey his parents in the Lord, for this is right. They're not going to know right and wrong if we don't uphold the nurture and admonition from the Lord. And so that's something that is so important as we're striving to teach our young people, our children, to hunger and thirst for something that's not going to go out of style in a week or need to be upgraded in a day. For something that is lasting, something that is upright and not downright wrong. We need a hunger and thirst for righteousness. So it's not up to you and me to come up with what that righteousness is. That's why he said in verse 20 of Matthew 5, if you'll turn back to Matthew chapter 5, there in verse 20, he says, I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. See, he has just explained to them that you are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden. Verse 15, he says, nor do people light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a stand, and it gives light to all in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others so that they may see your good works and give you the glory. Wow, you're such a good person. Look at the good things that you're doing. Wow, I am just so impressed with you. Is that what he's saying? In the same way, let your light shine before others so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who is in heaven. If we follow this, if we follow his teaching, we will be the light of the world. But how many people look at what we do and they might say good job, or they might say the opposite. And they don't see the glory of God. No wonder this world hates God. No wonder this world misunderstands God and misunderstands his Son. If we're not willing to stand up and be the light and represent his glory, not our own. You see, that's who the audience was. The Pharisees and the scribes, they were all about their glory, rich in spirit, remember? And so these are the people that Jesus is speaking to, and he's saying to them something they've never thought of. He said, unless your righteousness goes beyond, it surpasses the scribes and the Pharisees, you'll not enter the kingdom of heaven. Jesus is just talking about what it means to be a part of the kingdom, and they're sitting there going, what? Mind blown. This is something that they would not understand. And so he gives us 6 times he's going to focus on, you have heard that it was said, but I say to you. He's giving us 6 different times that the Pharisees and scribes have taught something to the Jewish people, but he's telling them the opposite. He's telling them what they should do. And for those of you who are following along in the notes, I've got 3 blanks that are there. Because next week we're going to focus on the next 3. Those are represented for anger, lust, and divorce. And so you'll have to put the notes there next to it. So someone mentioned at the early service, make sure that you dedicate that to anger, lust, and divorce. So we're going to be looking at those 3 this morning, and so we have a lot of, we got to be busy with this, to focus on what Jesus is telling us. It is not up to us to come up with what is righteous or what is not. I'm a good person. Well, you talk to anyone, and they're going to say, I'm a good person, because we can justify anything, can we not? But we are not the justifiers. God is. It is not self-righteousness. It is God's righteousness. And so Jesus begins in verse 21. He tells us that we must have righteous living with our brother and our sister. And it must be, he mentions it based on anger. Verse 21. You've heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not murder, and whoever murders will be liable to judgment. Notice, you shall not murder, that's straight from the 10 Commandments. But whoever murders will be liable to judgment. They've added that there. The concept there is they're more focused on the final act of a dispute with someone that leads to murder. They're more focused on that as the Ten Commandments. Anything else goes as far as a Pharisee or a scribe is concerned. Notice what Jesus says. But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother will be liable to judgment. Whoever insults his brother will be liable to the council. Whoever says, "You fool," will be liable to the hell of fire. This is the righteousness that Jesus is talking about. He's more concerned with the first step that leads to murder, anger. If you get angry with your brother, you probably at that point would never consider murder as the next step. But it is the first step that leads to an altercation that would result in murder or premeditated. So Jesus is more concerned about that with a brother, to have righteous living with our brother, to not allow anger to stand. Because how many times do we get angry with each other and that never goes unresolved? He also says that anger, we've got to have righteous living with our brother because it affects our relationship with God. If you look, verse 23 says, "So if you are offering your gift at the altar, and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go. First be reconciled to your brother and then come and offer your gift." We got to see that we can't allow anger to stand and still worship God. We're fooling ourselves. We're not living in a righteous life. We can't hold on to that anger. Notice he says it also, he brings out the world. We've got to show that anger cannot stand when it comes to the world. Verse 25, "Come to terms quickly with your accuser while you are going with him to court, lest your accuser hand you over to the judge, and the judge to the guard, and you be put in prison. Truly I say to you, you will never get out until you have paid the last penny." You see, we have got a responsibility. We're the light of the world. But say we get angry with someone who mistreats us, cuts us off on the interstate, and we follow him. Or we get angry with our neighbor because of the way he cut his grass, or maybe he was poisoning his side of the yard and it got onto your flowers. Are your flowers more important than your neighbor? We must make sure that anger doesn't stand because we're to be the light of the world, and not put that light under that basket. So next he's going to focus on this righteous living with our neighbor and our neighbor's wife. Specifically, verse 27, he says, "You have heard that it was said, 'You shall not commit adultery.'" See, they're more focused on the final result, not the beginning of adultery. But Jesus is going to again focus on the beginning of adultery. Verse 28, "But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart." You realize that when it comes to righteous living, God does not want us to look at someone as if they're a piece of meat, as if they're a possession that we can look to. So guys, this is something for us, is that when it comes to, this is in our face all of the time in this world. Girls, you need to realize that you are more beautiful than your skin. And so when it comes to this, we see that a righteous living is not looking at someone in this way. Notice he explains also how to live a righteous life surrounded by worldliness, surrounded by those who would do the very opposite from what Jesus just said. Notice what he says, and sometimes this goes in one ear out the other. We just keep going on. But he says, "If your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. For it is better than you lose one of your members than that your whole body be thrown into hell." Verse 30, "And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. For it is better that you lose one of your members than that your whole body go into hell." So if he's saying, what's on the line here? Heaven and hell is what's on the line when it comes to this kind of sin. And he's saying we need to be willing to cut out an eye if it's going to cause us to sin. Cut off a hand if it's going to cause us to sin. Well, if cable causes us to sin, are we willing to cut it off? If the internet causes us to sin, are we willing to cut it off? If our phone and a certain app on that phone causes us to sin, are we willing to cut it off? Maybe Snapchat is causing you to stumble. You need to delete it off your phone. Maybe with the way that the phone works, it's a little computer. Maybe you need to go back to the flip phone just to help you stop this thing, because this is what we are inundated in this world. Are we willing to cut it off to make sure that we stand for righteousness, the righteousness that God is telling us to do? Because it leads to something else. Well, it leads to hell. But in this life, it leads to something else. We're supposed to have a righteous living with our spouse. We're not just playing house. Verse 31, it says, "It was also said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife, except on the ground of sexual immorality, makes her commit adultery. Whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery." I want you to see what Jesus is dealing with is the traditions of the Pharisees and the scribes. You see, they wrote down traditions. It's called the Mishnah within the Talmud. And the Mishnah said during the time of Jesus, if a woman was betrothed to be married on the condition that she has no bodily defects, and she was found to have such defects, her betrothal is invalid. But if he married her without making any conditions, and she was found to have bodily defects, she may be divorced without a ketubah. All defects, listen to this, all defects which disqualify priests disqualify women also. So if you look at the old law and you look at the disqualifications of a priest to be able to serve God in the temple, this was what they applied to women. So, if a woman had a broken foot, a broken hand, or one leg longer than the other, the husband could divorce her. You see, when Matthew 19, when Jesus tells them that Moses permitted that certificate of divorce because of the hardness of your heart, look at where their heart had gone. They had literally, the men had put themselves on the level of God and His priests. They were above a woman in that way. From the beginning, it was not so. And for our time, we can't go there. But we will spend more time on these in the future. And we will be looking at the next three next week. But if we think that we can harbor anger in our hearts and be satisfied when we retaliate, it's not going to happen. If we allow our eyes to be filled with lustful images and think that that will bring satisfaction, it will bring the opposite. How many relationships have been destroyed? How many lives have been destroyed over just holding on to a grudge? How many families have lost loved ones who are still living? If we are callous to the idea of divorce for any reason other than what Christ has explained, say, well, God would want me to be happy. You're doing exactly what the Pharisees and the scribes did when they put themselves on the level of God, because God in no way ever said that line. You're lying to yourself, and you're lying to others. And that lie has got to stop. If that's the case, you're living for self-righteousness and not God's. If this be true, we cannot call ourselves Christians. I have a grandfather who looks at Christianity, and he looks at all of the hypocrisy in Christianity, and he says, if that's Christianity, I don't want any part of it. He cut my mother off when she became a Christian because he didn't want his money to go to the church. So she was a new Christian in college, and she struggled. But when my twin sister and I came along, they wanted to have that door open to us so they could continue to have that relationship. But my grandfather, he's 84, and every time I get on the phone with him or on Skype, you still preaching that gospel? I'm still breathing. And I pray for my grandfather. I want him to overcome. But you look at his life, and I see these things that God is offering, what Jesus is giving us, and I see the opposite. And I don't see fulfillment. I don't see satisfaction. And this is what Jesus offers us. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. It is satisfaction guaranteed. So if you try to fill your empty plate with anger and holding on to that, if you try to fill that empty plate with lust, or that leads to divorce of the wife of your youth or the husband of your youth, to try to just have that hole fulfilled, it will not. He's saying, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the day, you'll not enter the kingdom of heaven. Kingdom of heaven is what's on the line. Are you a part of the kingdom this morning? Are you devoted to the teaching that Jesus has given us as why we're here? But maybe you've been living for self-righteousness and you've recognized that the paths you've gone down haven't boded well for you. Maybe you need encouragement. Maybe there's someone here that you can reach out to. I want you to reach out to them and explain to them the struggles that you're having. But maybe the struggle that you've had is something that's been public, and you need to let the whole congregation know so that we can pray with you and talk to God about you and for you, not to each other. Strive to encourage you. This invitation is for you. But maybe you see the difference in the world and you see darkness and you're seeing a little bit of light and you want to know more. We want to study with you. The elders here, I would love to study with you. JJ would love to study with you. If there's something that we can do to try to help you see the light even further so that you can be added to the body, the same way those in the long ago were, this invitation is also for you. But you need to repent of the sin that's in your life. The plate that might be full that needs to be emptied, and He's willing to empty it. He's willing to clean it, and it'll be brand new, ready to be filled with His righteousness, and you'll be satisfied. Confessing that Jesus is Lord and being baptized in His name for the forgiveness of your sins. You have that need this morning. Don't wait. Won't you come? All together we stand and sing.